Hey, look out. It's Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
Gary Bates with us from Creation Ministries. We always love having Gary. And I did my That's Not a Knife, This Is a Knife. And he said I wasn't even close. I always thought I was at least, I don't know, 50% close.
What would you rate him, Gary?
Don't even know what a knife is. You mean a knife?
A knife. It's a knife.
Knife.
I like that, Gary. That's very Southern. A knife. Give me a knife.
All right, Crocodile Dundee. Let's hear you say it.
Well, now, that's not a knife. That's a knife.
There you go. That's it.
Hey, was he really an Aussie, or was he an actor just trying?
No, he's an Aussie. He was on originally on a talent show in Australia many moons ago, a bit like America's Got Talent type thing.
Yeah,
and he got went on there as a stand-up comedian.
Really? Uh-oh, Gary froze there.
Well, that's what he gets for talking about Crocodile Dundee, right? There you go. And my impersonation.
And your impersonation. Well, I guess we'll talk amongst ourselves until Gary is unfrozen.
You think maybe he's doing that on purpose? And
he's
wanting
us. Could very well be. There he is. I think he's back. I saw him move.
I had this black screen and the little circles falling there.
All right, you're back now. Okay, that's good. We thought you were just pretending, and
that's what we get for talking about Paul. It was Paul Hogan.
Paul Hogan, yeah.
Paul Hogan, yeah.
Anyway. I digress. Well, it's good to see you. I read some of your articles. I think it was released this morning. Well, it was September 24th, 2020. Climate change and LGBT issues. What's the creation connection? I thought that very, very interesting. And as you mentioned in the article, those are the questions you get quite a bit. Not like the old days, right? Are dinosaurs real? But this seems to be kind of the cultural questions of the time, right?
Well, the reason is because in Christian families, our young ones are being exposed to these types of issues that you might not have been exposed to, many, many years ago. Our youngsters, we think they're just going to be educated, and that education is neutral. I'll give you one example, and I try to warn pastors even when I speak in churches, because typically if you're reading from the scriptures and you'll read about homosexuality, for example, it's a sin, they're going to burn in hell. And I often say, try to think what your young people are hearing. Homosexuals are evil people.
Right.
But then they go to school and the college and they meet really, really nice gay people, they're friendly, they're loving, and they're kind of, well, that's not what I really heard. And there are these stereotypical arguments. Well, it's okay if people love each other and people are born that way, etc. We wrote a booklet, and that article on our website is about that, called Gay Marriage, Right or Wrong. And we wrote it in a very, very loving tone because we, often get Christian families who say that their young ones are struggling with this. Like everything else, guys, people have opinions. And, when people say, well, maybe they're like this or maybe like that, if we are going to be consistent Christians, we obviously have to go back to the Bible to say, what does it say about this thing? And that article today about, climate change and LGBT issues, if you look in that Romans passage I mentioned there, it talks about people will worship the created thing rather than the creator.
Right.
But the very next verse from there, it talks about the link is, therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their heart to impurity, dishonoring of their bodies, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worship the creature and the creator. And then it says, for women exchange natural relations that are those contrary to nature, and likewise men gave up relations with women. So it's kind of strange that, Paul's talking about forgetting God is creator. And if you do that, the very next thing that happens is you'll give yourself over to these lustful desires. And that's the thing we have to recognize. Sin is about, what we do that is wrong. But how do you define what is wrong? Well, only the creator can do that.
Right.
Because if he made the universe, he does, we call them rules, but, they're more guidelines, aren't they, for us to have a happy and prosperous life. And if we reject God as creator, well, then you can make up your own rules about life. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So like a lot of things, I think Christians struggle, and they see these and they say, wow, that seems really harsh. And then they try to find places in the Bible to accommodate it. It's exactly the same with evolution, isn't it?
Yeah.
I sent you an article there about what is science, and people go to school and they're taught that, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, 212 Fahrenheit. Well, that's science. I can repeat and I can test those things. And then they hear dinosaurs evolved into birds 65 million years ago. Well, that's science as well. But it's actually not, is it? Because you can't test, repeat, or observe those things in the past. And again, it's that confusion. Then people, as I said, they think evolution is science. They try to fit that in the scripture somewhere. And, our experience, our ministry has been going for over 40 years, is that most people that try to do that end up on the slippery slope to unbelief.
Yeah.
And usually you'll find, our young people, when they try to accommodate things like homosexuality in the Bible, well, the Bible, what they're really doing is the Bible doesn't really mean what it says, and it leads them onto the slippery slope of unbelief as well.
Right.
So, we really have to plainly take God's word as written. We don't have to do it in a mean, vindictive way towards others, because, there go I, but for the grace of God. Sin is about what we do, not what we do. It's the fact that we are born sinful. That's as simple as that.
That's
and for
good.
one person, they struggle with some type of sin. Another will struggle with others. In God's eyes, obviously not all sin is equal on the earth. It can have different effects and ramifications. But in God's eyes, the smallest sin separates us from him.
Yeah.
So we make this arbitrary judgment about what is worse, or, at the end of the day, before our creator God, it's well, what doesn't Paul write? He said, while we were helpless sinners, or while we were still yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's the point.
Interesting. Gary Bates from Creation Ministries, CEO of Creation Ministries. Now, you're talking about science and what people accept as science and how it's fact. And it maybe obviously is not always fact, because you can't test and repeat it. But it just seems, to me at least, that the science community is getting more and more, I won't say hateful, but just more, I guess, passionate about their argument that what we see and what we say is right. Is that the case?
Yeah. Look, myself and, most of my scientific colleagues in the ministry are all former evolutionists. And the reason is because when they went into higher education, that's all you're taught. And that's what we try to point out to Christian parents is, as I said earlier, education is not kind of neutral in this. They will be taught evolution as a scientific fact. This is the idea, starts with the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. The Earth evolved, if you like, 4.5 billion years ago. You and I are basically just evolved pond scum. Apes became humans, and so on. And excuse me. And when you realize what's at stake, you'll understand why people are passionate. I'll read you a quote by a world leader in evolutionary biology. His name is Professor Richard Lewontin. And he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. He says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. And that materialism is, not in acquiring wealth or something like that. It's as in atoms are all there ever are, matter is all there is. So you'll often hear the argument, well, that's because, creation is religion and evolution is science. And he just used the word science. But, we in CMI, we kind of help people understand it this way. As we said, the type of science you and I understand, I can throw an object up and down and up and down. There it is, the theory of gravity, it's called. But the theory of evolution, it can't be tested. In a scientific realm, a theory is something you can repeat and test, like gravity. But evolution deals with these one-time events, as I mentioned before, that allegedly happen, that nobody saw, nobody can repeat or even test. So we put that in an area called, we call historical science, if you like, something like that. And as opposed to operational science, which we would, kind of understand more as the experimental method. If I could read one short quote. Some years ago, there was a famous debate between creationist Ken Ham and Bill Nye.
Right.
And Bill Nye raised this argument. He said, yes, he says creationists have been making this artificial distinction between operational science and historical science. He said it doesn't exist in the real world. Well, Dr. E.O. Wilson is arguably one of the world's most famous scientists, a biologist from Harvard. And he says, if a moving automobile were an organism, functional biology would explain how it's constructed and operated. That's operational science. Take it apart, find out how it works. But he says, while evolutionary biology, in other words, history, would reconstruct its origin in history and how it came to be made and its journey thus far. But the problem is you can't do the second one, can you? You can't reconstruct something's history because you were not there. And this is the confusing part for so many Christians. They hear, wow, did you see that program? They found a dinosaur fossil that was 150 million years old. Well, you don't dig them up out of the ground with labels on them. They might do scientific tests like radiometric dating, but there is actually no scientific test you can use to prove the age of things. It doesn't work like that. So they already have a constructed theory of how the world came to be. And, they might find a fossil in a certain type of rock. And they'll say, well, it must be so old because we found it in rock strata that is so far down, and they determine the age. But then the geologist, when he looks at the rock, he'll often say, what type of fossils did we find in there? And he'll use that to date the rock. It's very, very circular. And that's, that picture of the geologic column that people see. But the reality is we don't really see that column in situ in any one place in the world. There is a general order to it. But again, the creationist interpretation of that would say, well, that's an order of burial from the flood, because at the very bottom of the column, we find sea creatures that live on the ocean floor, algae, sponges. And then as you go up, you have marine creatures, then you have terrestrial animals, and then you have man. But if there was a worldwide flood that started in the deep oceans, that's the order of burial you'd expect to see in the rock record. And here's the interesting thing. How long did the flood last? It was the waters covered the earth for 12 months. But the evolutionary community says that column there represents hundreds and hundreds of millions of years of Earth's history. But if most of it was laid down in Noah's flood, there is no hundreds of millions of years.
Right.
So creationists and evolutionists have the same facts, but we interpret them differently according to our view of history. So both creation and evolution are forms of historical science. It's not the type of science that builds radio stations and sends man to the moon. That's the operational science or functional science that Wilson spoke about.
It's interesting that this gospel has been preached for generations, where now it's fact in our culture. There's no thought. It's like your doctor comes to you and he gives you his expertise, and you go, okay, well, he's a doctor. He must know. I
trust him. Yeah.
And instead of questioning the fact that it is a theory, it seems like that's not even in the thought of the average person that's been educated for the last, 25, 30 years. I mean, it's been forever since I've been in school. But when I was in school, there was still that creation part that was being taught. I mean, that's the 60s and the 70s, really the early 70s. But all of a sudden, there was a disconnect, and it was the pure gospel of evolution, which became fact eventually.
Very interesting. Our Australian ministry and one of our scientists, Dr. Dodd Batten, who's now the CEO there, he tracked the same thing in Australia. up until the 1950s, evolution was not taught as a scientific fact in the schools. And then from the 50s onwards, it started to be taught until, of course, like you say today, it is the only view that is taught. He also linked some interesting statistics. From about the same time that evolution was taught in school, we had an increase in youth suicide. We had an increase in property crime, violent crime, and it continued to spike until it plateaued around about the 1970s, which is the time when evolution was, taught unquestionably. So it gets back to that passage we mentioned in Romans, didn't it? Because again, when you teach people there's no creator or no God to be accountable to, then who's to say it's wrong to go and sleep with another man? Well, at the end of the day, well, you've got a big, nice widescreen TV, and I don't think I should pay for one. So if I can get away with it, why shouldn't I? I mean, who's going to see me if I can get away with it, etc.
Right.
And I remember being in school. I wasn't brought up in a Christian household, but it was school at a time. I was educated in my younger years in the UK, but we had morning assemblies. We sang hymns and prayers. That was the standard. But then at the same time, I was going off to my classroom and being taught evolutionary biology, for example, in my biology classes. And I remembered the disconnect, and I went through exactly the same thing. Well, that is science. But I used to lie in bed at night thinking about the things that I'd done wrong during the day. And I would think, but if there is a God, he saw me do that. There was still that in the back of my mind, that there's a creator, there's a God, that judges and who's right and wrong. And then over the years, especially when I got into my teenage years, I basically became a full-on evolutionist, and that was that. And I didn't become a Christian until my adult years. So I've had that experience. And, on your show, I've mentioned before, if people go to creation.com/fallout, one word, they'll see a survey that we did in college campuses around Atlanta. And we stood there, and as kids came past, we asked 4 questions. The first one was, were you raised in the church or not? If they said no, we let them move on. We only wanted these kids raised in the church. And the next question we asked was, creation or evolution, what's true? So these were kids raised in the church. And out of the hundreds of students we surveyed, we only found 5 that said they still believed in creation.
Wow.
And then the next question was, when you were at church, did your parents, pastors, leaders, anybody show you the scientific evidence that biblical creation might be true? And this is the honest truth, guys. Every single student who said they were raised in a Christian home, who now believed in evolution, every single one said they'd never been shown any information for creation. But the 5 young people that said they still believed in creation, every single one had been shown evidence.
Wow.
And the last question was, do you still attend church? And all those young people that now believed in evolution, except for one young man, and we kind of included him in the video to show we were not stacking the deck, no longer attends church today. So you can't get anything more fundamental than Genesis 1:1. That's it. It sets it up, doesn't it, for everything that comes along. If you don't accept Genesis 1:1, then really you may as well just throw the rest of the Bible away.
Yeah.
Because even the reason Christ came, you look at Genesis chapter 3, the fall, right? God says, I will curse the ground, put enmity between, you and the woman. We live in a fallen world. So here we are living in the midst of a pandemic. We've discussed before, did God make viruses? Where do they come from? Death and sin has entered the world as a result of what happened in Genesis 3. But evolution says, no, it's survival of the fittest. Hey, just get used to it, Strongest will survive. If you don't survive COVID-19, well, that's just natural selection. And hey, tough.
Yeah.
So that's the view with which our public education system, it's a set of glasses that are put on our young ones today.
Now, Gary, before we run out of time here, for those parents who may be watching and saying, okay, that's great. If I show my kids the scientific evidence for creationism, that might help them as they go off to college, but I don't know where to start. Do you guys have information, and where can they turn to find that?
Yeah, it's really easy. Very difficult website to remember, I'm afraid. It's called creation.com.
Oh, nobody's going to remember that.
There's over 12,500 articles on there. And you can type in, for example, in the search engine, who did Cain marry? What about natural selection? What about carbon-14 dating? You literally type those things in there. And we have a web store, and there are thousands and thousands of resources, right from elementary age right up to technical. But the best resource we found over the years, we've been publishing for over 40 years, is Creation Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a no advertising magazine. There's no adverts in it. So, we're a faith-funded ministry. That gets sent to you in your home, and it arrives kind of seamlessly. And the feedback we've had is people often tell us the kids now are the first ones to grab it and read it. So again, just to re-emphasize, if your children are in public school, they will be taught evolution. It's not a maybe or perhaps. Now, they're going to church on Sunday, but are they being shown biblical creation? No, they're being taught, Bible stories, passages from Scripture. But we've got to stop the disconnect from Genesis 1:1 and help them understand that is true. It's also scientifically valid if you look at it with the biblical lens on. And so once you do that, we found that it kind of turbocharges people's faith. Parents obviously are not scientists. They don't necessarily have the answers, but by leading the young ones to resources and providing some information into the home, they can sit down there, learn together, basically. It's not very hard.
Awesome.
That's good. Gary, we got to go to a break. We'd love to catch up with you next month. You always have something amazing to say. Thank you for laying down your life and continuing what God has called you to do. Creation.com is the place to go to. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is Faith Talk Live.